Hi everyone, I am sorry to be out today, but I am not feeling great, so I'm gonna take the day and stay home. But I wanted to move us forward in our discussion of UK government. We talked about the executive branch last week, and this lesson will focus on the legislative and judicial branches. So, as we have discussed, the UK is a parliamentary system, and we know that that means that legislative and executive functions are fused. We know that the Prime Minister is the head of the executive branch, while also being a member of the Parliament. So they call their legislative body the Parliament. It is a bicameral legislature with an upper house known as the House of Lords and a lower house known as the House of Commons. In modern UK government, the House of Commons holds all the power. You guys are about to see that the House of Lords does have some legislative functions, but they are largely ceremonial at this point. The House of Lords are appointed. We'll talk about how that happens. And the House of Commons is the elected body of the legislature. So, as we said, the House of Commons is elected by the people through a process known as single member district plurality, also known as first past the post. More on that in a few minutes. Um, Once you are in that position, you hold that position until Parliament is dissolved. So in the UK, there's a maximum of 5 years in between elections. So unlike a presidential system where election dates are often fixed, it's not that way in a parliamentary system. So they must have elections within 5 years, but they could have an election in 1 year. They could have one in 3 years. The most recent one was about 4.5 years before they had new elections. Um, Members in the body are known as MPs or members of parliament. They have no term limits, so they can just serve and serve and serve. As we know, because this is a parliamentary system, they select the prime minister from the other members of the parliament. So whichever party has the most seats in the parliament is in the position to select the prime minister. Other parties will have candidates, but you know, if the math is going to math, whoever has the most seats is going to win. Party is going to win that position. One of the things that we've learned, the term government is the party in control. So currently Labor would be the government, and the party in opposition would be the minority party. At this point is the Conservatives. Now, as we've said, there are lots of other parties in the UK system that we will get to in the next couple of lessons, but it's really a two-party dominant system. Okay, now for more about how seats in the House of Commons are chosen. It is a process known as single member district plurality. You will frequently see it abbreviated as SMDP. It is also known as first past the post, which you will see abbreviated as FPTP. So the way that the British parliamentary election works, it is a winner take all system. So each party selects a single candidate to run in a particular district. That's the single member part, okay? The candidate that wins is the candidate that receives the most votes. You do not have to win a majority of the votes. That's the plurality part, okay? So single member means that your party selects one person to vote in that district. Whoever wins, whoever comes in first wins, even if they don't get a majority of the votes. So if you win, but you don't win a majority, 50% or more, that is called a plurality vote, okay? As you guys are going to see, this is going to help the two dominant parties, Labor and Conservative, because it concentrates their votes, okay? It also helps smaller regional parties, such as the Scottish National Party, because it concentrates their votes, okay? It hurts smaller ideological parties because it spreads their votes out. You guys are going to see that this affects parties such as the Liberal Democrats. There's a Green Party. We're going to go through all of those different ones. But we just have to be aware of what kind of parties the system helps and what kind of parties the system hurts. Current membership in the House of Commons is 650 people. That is more representatives than most lower houses in the world. For example, the US doesn't really have an upper house, lower house, okay? But if we want to compare this to the House of Representatives, the House of Representatives membership is 435, and the US population is significantly larger than the population of the UK. So what this creates is districts that are very small, which means as a representative, as an MP, you are representing a relatively small number of people. This puts MPs closer to the people, and in theory, um, gives them a better understanding of what the people that they represent want. So it can be a great thing for legitimacy. It can be a great thing for efficacy because people feel that they have more of a role to play and somebody who is closer to them who is listening to their wants and needs. So this is a map that gives you information about the most recent election in the UK that happened on July 4th, 2024. On the left side, you have the hex map that sort of gives you an idea of the size of the constituencies. And then the other side kind of shows it to you over the kind of a landmass. Really what we're interested in here are the different political parties. So red is the Labour Party, and you can see that they won and won big, as I had been predicting since 2022, just based off of everything that happened in that fall. The Conservative Party was next. You can see them represented in blue with 121 seats. A couple of things to note from this election, and that is a pretty good increase of seats for the Liberal Democratic Party, 72 seats. They're represented in orange. And a pretty swift decrease for the Scottish National Party with only 9 seats. You can see the rest of the parties represented here. We'll talk about them more in the coming days. This is a 2024 sample ballot, and you can see just for one example district, all the different options that voters had when they went to the polls. So here in the US, we're used to there being 2 parties, 2 options, that's it. You can see just in this particular ballot that they had 7 different options to pick for their member of parliament. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the rules in terms of how often elections must be held and how to have elections sooner. The current law that dictates British election law is the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act of 2022. This is something like the 3rd different law in like the last 15 years. So they kind of keep changing it and messing it around. These are the current election rules and replaced the Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2011. So basically this is what it says. The parliament must have elections a maximum of every 5 years. So elections were just held on July 4th, 2024. According to British law, the next election must take place no later than August 15th, 2029. In recent British history, the odds of us going all the way to August of 2029 are pretty slim. For example, this past election was required to have been held by December, and former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak ended up calling those elections about 6 months early. Prior to that, we went a whole kind of series of years where parliaments were making it like 2 years and having to have a new election. So how does that happen? One of the ways that it can happen is through the House of Commons passing a vote of no confidence. Essentially, if a party were to decide that they wanted to change its leadership, they would pass a vote of no confidence, which would automatically trigger elections. So that is a way in a parliamentary system for you to get rid of your leader before the end of the current parliament's term, if you will. Okay. Votes of no confidence, for example, the last one was back in the summer of 2022 when there was a vote of no confidence on former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now, he managed to survive that vote. However, when your party holds a vote of no confidence against you, it is not a great sign for your political future. And by September of 2022, the Conservative Party changed leadership. So that's one way, okay? The other way is for the Prime Minister to go to the King ask the king for permission to dissolve parliament. The king is going to say yes. And when that happens, the parliament is dissolved and we enter a period of elections. So I have on this slide for you kind of what the period looked like in this most recent election. You can see that former Prime Minister Sunak called for elections on May 22nd. And then the parliament was dissolved. Basically, they had a couple of days to sort of finish the business of that parliament, and then parliament was dissolved on May 30th. So from May 30th into July 4th, that was the campaign period. Okay, so in the United States, we are used to elections that go on and on and on and on. That is fairly rare in the international community. It's fairly rare in the countries that we are going to study. For most of these places, it is a fixed amount of time, usually a matter of weeks, before moving into the election. Now, I would imagine some of you have already thought about what happens when no party has a majority of the seats. That is known as a hung parliament and has happened multiple times in the last 15 years. 2010, 2017, 2019. A hung parliament is when no party has a majority in the House of Commons. So what happens is the party with the most seats has to find another party to join them in the government. It's called a coalition. So, for example, in 2017, the conservatives went to the liberal Democrats and formed a coalition. So, essentially, what happens is that smaller party agrees to sort of throw their votes behind the other party's candidate. And then, in return, typically that smaller party will get some kind of concessions. A bill brought up that they want to discuss, or some seats in the cabinet. In 2019, the Conservatives formed a coalition with one of the small parties of Northern Ireland. So typically what this shows is sort of a deeper division in British politics. And, I can tell you a lot of these disputes are around Brexit that we've seen in sort of recent memory. A couple of quirks around British elections. First of all, MPs do not have to live in the district that they represent. Parties get to decide who runs in each district. Party loyalty is usually very strong because if you don't have to run within your district, it is very easy for your party to replace you. So is it possible, I'm just going to use a geographic example that we understand, that I could live in Canton and represent Macon? Yes. According to the British system of government, that is perfectly acceptable. So here's what party leaders do. They decide who their most important MPs are, and they place those MPs in what are called safe districts. Safe districts are one in which you know that your party's going to win. It doesn't matter who you run, the people in that area are very supportive of your party. So you put all of your most important leaders in those districts because those are your safe seats. You know that you're going to win those. All right, now let's shift and talk about the House of Lords, which again is an appointment kind of situation. So we're going to talk about how that works. The UK contains the only parliament in the world with hereditary seats, meaning you inherited that seat from your father, who inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his father, and so on and so forth. This is how you become the 15th Duke of Osborne. That's the way that it happens, okay? The House of Lords don't have a ton of power. They're not elected. And so in a modern democracy, it's sort of awkward, okay? Parliament can delay legislation. They can debate technicalities of proposed bills. They can add amendments onto legislation. But ultimately, the House of Commons can overrule those amendments with a majority vote. Essentially, what they do is they serve as a minor check on power in the House of Commons. How do you become a member of the House of Lords? There's a couple of ways that this happens. Number one, there's a group called Lords Spiritual. These are religious leaders, typically high-ranking members of the Church of England. Remember, the UK has a state religion. It is the Church of England. Okay. Next are the Lords Temporal. The first one under those are hereditary peers. Those are the ones we were just talking about, where seats are passed down through families. They are phasing these out. We're about to talk about that a little bit more in a second. The next one, and where the most seats come from today, are life peers. These are people appointed to non-hereditary positions based on years of service. So, for example, we're going to see around the times of elections. Essentially, this is a way to sort of reward people for their years of service in the party. You could make a former prime minister a life peer. Um, Typically, we'll talk in a minute about how this works, but it's an appointed position, typically for years of service. Sorry, I'm noticing the slide still says the Queen, but basically, how you become a life peer. You are selected by the King on advice of the Prime Minister and an independent commission. So essentially what's going to happen is like the Prime Minister and this group of people are going to come up with a list of people. Are they likely to favor people from their political party? The answer is yes. Once they have that list, they take it over to the king and the king approves it. Ceremonial. Okay. Um, the House of Lords Appointment Commission is the group that vets these candidates and makes recommendations. So that's like where the Prime Minister gets the list from. There are currently 799 members of the House of Lords. 683 of them are life peers, 92 are hereditary peers, and 24 are Lords Spiritual. This gives you an idea of the party background of those lords. We've just come off a long period of the Conservative Party being in charge. Gosh, probably going back to somewhere around 2010. So that would help explain why there's way more of them. You can also see the bishops on here and then other smaller parties. I tried to find a more updated version of this graph and was unsuccessful, okay, but the trend holds. You tend to see more life peers appointed around the times of elections. It's a great way to reward people who have helped your party over the years and try to, keep their support during a time of an election. So there's a lot of conversation in the UK right now about what to do about the House of Lords. Obviously, this seems like a strange thing to still have in 2024 2025 in a democratic state. So back in November, the House of Commons actually voted to abolish the 92 hereditary seats. And it wasn't by a little, okay? It was by a large majority. Now, unfortunately, what happens from there is the bill goes on to the House of Lords. And of course, probably the, 92 hereditary peers are unlikely to vote to lose their seats. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But there are a lot of members, particularly of the Labour Party, who are talking about larger changes. One of the things they want to put in place is an age of 80 mandatory retirement age. So when you turn 80, you have to go. Some members are talking about the removal of bishops. Why are religious figures in a democratic state able to hold such positions? So I think it'll be really interesting. We've talked about gradualism in the UK. We've talked about the fact that they are slow to change. But I do think it's interesting that they're having these conversations, and I do think it's something we should watch. That's my dog. As we've discussed, the UK uses a common law system. You're very likely to find this in all former British Empire countries. So remember, this is based off of precedent. It's based off of tradition. They do have a rule of law. Everybody must follow the rules, from the Prime Minister all the way down to average citizens. The UK has no death penalty anywhere in the state. They have a Supreme Court that was only recently established in 2009. But they don't have judicial review, so they can't overturn pieces of legislation like the Supreme Court can in the US. They are the highest appeals court in the land. They also hear issues of devolution. So anytime, for example, the rules of the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament don't match, the Supreme Court would hear those cases. For example, about 2 years ago, the Scottish National Party was talking about having another referendum about independence, and the Supreme Court said no. You can't even have the referendum. This is a picture of a recent UK Supreme Court. I can't promise you all these people are the same right now, Sadly, we do not have the super fun British barrister wigs. Here's another one where it still says the Queen. I'm sorry. Currently appointed by the King on advice of the Prime Minister, so it works kind of similarly to how it does for the House of Lords. The Prime Minister will get a list, take it to the King will approve. There are 12 justices, 9 of them are English, 2 are Scottish, 1 from Northern Ireland, and they have a mandatory retirement age of 75. All right, that's the end for today. I'm sorry this got to be a little bit on the long side, but please let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer those when I return. Thank you so much.